welcome back to the Ask podcast, where we hope today you'll be attaining some more secret knowledge with us. We're really focusing on bringing some light into a really dark period of history today, uncovering some stories perhaps that maybe don't get quite a fair hearing. Just to remind you, I'm Jenny Summers, Deputy Head of English and Drama at John Hampden Grammar School. I am a student of tragedy and redemption, so I feel like today might play into some of those kind of key themes that I'm interested in, but from more of a historical perspective. And this is my lovely colleague.
And I'm Mark Till, and I'm the Head of English. And yeah, very much looking forward to this conversation. We've got brilliant guests and panellists today. And if you're a student and you're listening to the podcast, worth saying again, do email us. It'd be really lovely to hear from you with things that you'd like to have as topics. Even if you want to be a guest yourself and you're a student, tell us what you'd like to come and talk about. And I think as well, if you see Mrs. Summers or I around school, just give us a bit of, if you're a podcast listener, just give us a bit of a nod, a bit of a smile, and we'll have a little community within a community, and we'll know who listens to the podcast, and we'll, give you better grades and free stuff.
You can quote that, apparently. Brilliant. Excellent. And our panellists, of course, we've got a returning panellist, Mr. James L, I should call you, because I'm not allowed to say your surname before I get in trouble.
Well, thank you very much for having me back on the podcast. It's great to be back. If you haven't listened to the first podcast where I was on with Mr. Sorden talking about Ernest Shackleton, where have you been? Anyway, if you weren't here, I'm James. I'm going to study history and politics at university next year, so I'm in year 13 at the moment. And again, can't wait for today's discussion.
Fantastic. And we've got a brilliant member of our production team. We've got Aman, and let him introduce himself today.
Yes, hello. My name is Aman. I am lower sixth. I study history, politics, German at A level, probably looking to study international political relations at university.
Wow. Watch out for Aman, clearly. And unusually, we've got a former pupil but now classroom assistant extraordinaire to come to share some of his wisdom with us and to ask some particularly probing questions. Mr. James Hoggett.
Thank you. I'm not sure how wisdomous I am, but I will do my best.
Wise, James, wise.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to set the bar low so I can surprise you later. No, James, I'm studying history and politics next year at university, but I'm taking a gap year. I was hoping, slightly pertinent to today's topic, to be travelling around Israel and the Middle East, but instead I'm here as a classroom assistant inspiring the next generation of young people.
Excellent. Modest as well. Yeah. And last but certainly not least, we have our fantastic guest today, Miss Beth Labonte, history teacher and cross-country extraordinaire, it must be said. Yes. And we've got a really interesting topic today, talking about Jewish resistance in the ghettos during World War II. So as I said before, quite a dark topic, but I'm really hoping we're going to learn some unusual new stuff about that today. So why did you choose this topic, first of all?
So in Canada, you can kind of do a weird degree combination where you do a major and a minor. So I actually, this is kind of revealing, I started out as a sports science major, not a history major, with a minor in history. Decided I actually really liked history much more, and so switched my major and my minor halfway through. And so I guess for my undergraduate dissertation, and then later I expanded that as a research assistant in an MA project, I looked at medical resistance during the Holocaust, which kind of brought those two together, and in particular in the ghettos.
Fascinating. And I think we should do some basic background question first to zoom in. I'm thinking things like, what are ghettos and so on, just, I don't want to assume too much knowledge. So do you want to start off with that question?
Yeah, definitely. So actually the ghettos weren't initially created by the Nazis. It's actually a term that originated in Venice in the 16th century, and it was just to designate the Jewish kind of quarter, the Jewish area of the city. But that became changed by the Nazis when they kind of instituted it as a policy in 1939. And so I guess if we're thinking about the definition of it, there's actually 3 types of ghettos. So there's closed ghettos, which is what you normally think of, like surrounded by barbed wire, or in the case of the Warsaw Ghetto, like 3 to 5 meter high, like actual brick walls. But then there were open ghettos, which were essentially just like streets that you knew belonged to the Jewish community. And then finally there were destruction ghettos, which is where Jews were concentrated before being executed either in the gas chambers or kind of just in nearby areas like the forest, for example.
And Isabel, I realise this is a huge question, but just to do some of the background, maybe for younger podcast listeners, why in that place and at that point in history why were Jewish people in ghettos? I realize that's a huge question,
That
but
is
just
a
so people
huge
understand, because I
question.
guess if we don't know that, then there's...
Yeah, so there's kind of like two schools of thought around that, and I won't get too deep into that. But essentially, so when the Nazis came to power in 1933, they introduced anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish legislations, and therefore kind of historians debate, well, was the final solution of going to the extermination of Jews the kind of end goal in sight, or did it kind of just happen as it spiraled out of control? And so most argue that the creation of the ghettos was that bit where things were picking up. They didn't actually know what they wanted to do with the Jewish community just that. And so concentrating them in an area almost gave them that holding time. And another, I guess, reason why we get ghettos is Jews, the propaganda often kind of depicted them as vermin or as disease. And therefore separating them into an area of the city meant to the German people that they were being kind of saved from that germ, from that disease.
And brilliant. To extend that, can we get you to sort of elucidate your thesis a little bit? What's kind of your central argument, so that we can then, respond to that and ask some further questions?
Yeah, definitely. So there are kind of two established forms of resistance. In the Holocaust, there's armed resistance, which kind of, from the root of the word, it's taking up arms or violence to make change. So the Warsaw Ghetto uprising is the most famous example of that. Or there's spiritual resistance, which is kind of an effort to maintain normal life, so to take hold of like education or culture, and therefore it's actually resisting the Nazis because you're not letting yourself kind of be dehumanized. My thesis, I kind of took that one step further. I coined my own kind of form of resistance, which I called physical self-help. So it was an effort by Jews to kind of maintain their physical and mental well-being in order to kind of resist the end goal of ghettoization, which was death.
Could you tell us a little bit more about, I've kind of read some information about the different ghettos, and particularly the Warsaw Ghetto seems really interesting with the way that they were able to kind of control medicine and the public health there. Are you able to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, definitely. So the Warsaw Ghetto was the largest ghetto, and I think that's something really important to consider. So there was nearly 400,000 people in an area of just 1.3 square miles. So the average person was sharing a room with like 8 or 9 people, which meant that in terms of disease or proper sanitation, it was like the perfect storm. And so each council was run, or each ghetto, had a Jewish council, or a Judenrat, which was led by the Jewish elders. And in particular in the Warsaw Ghetto, they set up their own public health scheme to kind of help their Jewish community last longer and kind of make up for those poor living standards.
What sort of things were involved in kind of the public health campaigns? Were there sort of lectures and kind of possibly like underground universities to train doctors? Were these some of the things that happened?
Yeah, so if we're thinking about the Warsaw Ghetto itself, there was 3 hospitals within the Warsaw Ghetto. So there was an infectious disease hospital, a general hospital, and in particular they had as well a children's hospital. So that was really targeted at kind of ridding out disease as well as education. A really big means of resistance was smuggling. So small children in the ghettos would be given jackets or clothes that had many, many pockets sewn within it. They'd find a break in the barbed wire, for example, sneak out, and then they would go to local markets and try and bring back as much food as possible. And so this is really important because if you think about, in nutrition and GCSE, they say you need about 2,200, 2,400 calories a day at minimum. And the diet that you were being given in a ghetto was about 184 calories a day. And so supplementing that food source was so important, which is why smuggling was so important. And the Jewish councils would make that happen.
I guess a lot of these activities would have been incredibly dangerous as well.
Yeah, so if a Jew was found outside of the ghetto, they would be punishable by death, so they'd be shot. And because of the fact that they were all labelled either with armbands or with the Star of David, it'd be really easy to identify a Jew outside of the ghetto.
So I'd like to maybe touch on the spiritual resistance aspect of it. So I imagine a large part of that have been sort of celebrating Jewish festivals, that kind of thing. Something of a personal interest to me is the sort of rise of Jewish nationalism during the Holocaust. What impact do you think this obviously shared experience had on the formation of Jewish nationalism in this time, and what role did the sort of Jewish resistance play in this? Yeah,
definitely. So if we think again about the Warsaw Ghetto, there was 600 underground prayer groups that met because public worship was banned by the Nazis as kind of, again, an effort to rid out Jewish culture. And you're right, it's exactly that. It gave people to further explore their faith, or people who perhaps hadn't even viewed themselves as Jewish before. After the Holocaust, they kind of embodied that. And so the underground resistance, so the partisan units, a lot of those skills that they built up, if they were able to immigrate to Israel after the war, they brought that there with them.
Yeah, because something I'd encourage any listener of this podcast to look at is on the liberation of Bergen-Belsen and the Dimbleby report, and all the inmates singing the Hatikva, the current national anthem of Israel. That's very moving. So another aspect, I know this might be a bit niche, but he talks about the Judenrat. I'm sure a lot you've probably seen the film Schindler's List, where they're always like Jewish policemen within the ghetto. I know, has there been any controversy to the extent they maybe had to, in a limited way, collaborate with the Nazi regimes in order to maintain a certain standard of living, for example?
Definitely, and I think for those in the Jewish Council, it was a really hard line to toe because they wanted to look after their own communities, but they also realised that if they resisted, they knew that they themselves would be killed. And I guess a really tragic role that the Judenrats had to play was they would know if a ghetto was going to be kind of evacuated to extermination camps, they had to sit and organise those lists and say who would go first. So although their overarching kind of goal was to look after their own people, they did, for fear of their own life, have to collaborate.
Yeah. Aman?
I was going to say that must be an incredible toll on them, their mental health and them as people. Are there any stories of them after the war surviving and telling their testimonies? Or?
Yeah, testimony I think is a really important way to look at the Holocaust and those that have survived. If you go to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum website, they have hours and hours of testimony that you can access for free, and I think that's the best way, like personalising the Holocaust, to me, is the best way to learn about it.
So that was a deliberate strategy after the liberation of camps and so on, to have survivors tell their stories.
Exactly. And actually one form of resistance that I think is quite neat, it was known as the Oneg Shabbat Archive, or the Emanuel Ringelblum Archive, and members of the Warsaw Ghetto hid thousands of letters, thousands of pieces of information just about daily life, so interviewing teachers, interviewing children, so that way after the war we could actually know what it was like in ghettos. And they did that knowing that they probably wouldn't survive, but their testimony was so important.
This is probably an impossibly big question, but how do you think people found the bravery to, a lot of these, as you say, you get caught doing these things, it's death, they thought they probably wouldn't survive. How on earth do you think they found that well of courage to be able to do something like that?
I don't know, yeah, it's hard to say, because I know a lot of us, you are just having a bad day and you want to snuggle into your duvet and just kind of pretend that it's not happening out there. And yeah, I guess maybe that's really when your fight or flight kicks in, and you realise when your life is constantly under threat, maybe having a project art, people created art in the ghettos or contributing to these archives, it just helped them find that strength to get on from day to day.
And it's something some of us have been involved in the Lessons from Auschwitz project from the Holocaust Educational Trust, which I'm sure we found very interesting and important to do. And one of the things that stuck out for me from that project, kind of the resistance in the camps themselves. I think there were 4 or 5 cookbooks written by people in Auschwitz, because they were able to share lots of different recipes. So again, that's just this incredible form of resistance, I think.
So this is maybe a very hard question, and obviously you can never quantify it.
We're very good at very hard questions. Have you noticed that? It's one of our skills.
Well, it's almost an impossible topic, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a fair point.
What difference, maybe in material terms, did this Jewish resistance make? We obviously know that the resistance has had a huge impact on our understanding of the Holocaust and obviously the lived experience of that time. But in terms of material help for people, is there any estimates how many lives it may have saved, or how many generations of Jewish people have been saved as a result of it?
I think it's really hard to quantify, but because of the fact that so many of these ghettos were ultimately liquidated anyways, I think it did, however, save thousands while they were living within the ghettos themselves, just not dying from starvation, or that having that internal resolve is so important if you're physically unwell to keep fighting. So although many of them in turn kind of faced death, it helped them get there, last longer essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And I still think it's therefore significant.
Do you find as a teacher, obviously this is a subject that you specialise in, and I know that at the school you have put together assemblies and you invite speakers, and something that you really lead and is really important to you. Do you find that it's difficult as a subject to treat it as a subject like other historical topics, because it's so emotive, the human evil at the back of it is so extreme, and yet the spirit of the people to carry on, as you say, living and resisting is so great that it's very, very hard to treat it like another topic. And what's that like as a history teacher, having a topic that clearly means so much to you, but that is so difficult because you almost have to come in with caveats, and you almost have to say that this is really horrific, we're talking about something so difficult. The topic seems to carry so much around it. Is that a struggle, or do you think that's the power of it as a subject?
I think yes and no. I think in terms of working at John Hampden, we're so lucky that, as a community, boys are mature and they're reflective, and therefore they really take the time to put themselves in the shoes of both the perpetrators, so those that enacted the Holocaust, and its victims. And I think something that even I took away from when boys at the school did the Lessons from Auschwitz program is the importance of keeping it personal. So to not get bogged down in statistics, but instead to think about the individual stories, because I think that's the most powerful way in which we can explore the Holocaust.
Yeah.
On that note, do you have any particular individuals that you'd like to highlight, a particular example that you think that maybe people don't know about that you can share with us in particular?
I guess we can think of the head of the Jewish Council in Warsaw. So Adam Cherniakov, he was in charge of the Jewish Council in the Warsaw Ghetto, so overseeing nearly 400,000 people, and he was just so important for setting up public sanitation areas. So for example, in the Warsaw Ghetto, they had 3 public baths where people could go and ensure that they didn't catch typhus. He was important. He fought for people not to be liquidated as quickly as the Nazis had intended it to be. He created soup kitchens so people could go bolster their nutrition. And so I think the power of one person, just those organization skills that he possessed, really for those individuals made a huge difference.
And what do you think had a bigger impact? And it's very difficult to quantify, but was it the armed resistance, or was it the spiritual resistance, or was it a mixture of all?
I'd say, to be honest, although we like to get behind armed resistance, I think it was the spiritual resistance or the medical resistance that I kind of specialized. I think that had a bigger impact because, for example, after the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in April and May of 1943, once it was crushed by the Nazis, they just burnt down, they razed the entire ghetto. And so therefore any survivors that had been hiding out actually died. Whereas I think the spiritual resistance and that kind of inner power it gave people, it actually allowed them to achieve much more.
I think I read that you mentioned typhus a minute ago, and I think I read that there seemed to be an outbreak, and then they somehow managed to suppress that outbreak of typhus and bring it down. How on earth did they manage to do that?
Well, it's really cool actually. In one of the ghettos they set up a vaccination scheme, which seems a bit bizarre that the Nazis would help sponsor a vaccination scheme, but it was because during the Holocaust they were doing quite a bit of medical research, and so they tried it on residents of the ghetto, and it actually was quite helpful in ruling out disease. And another thing that I found quite interesting is the Vilna Ghetto actually created their own multivitamins.
Wow.
And so they extracted calcium and phosphorus from horse bones and gave it to the residents of the residents of the ghetto. So although it seems so novel, it's those little acts that really met up for that nutritional deficiency that they were having.
That's quite incredible, and it must have taken quite the community and the community spirit to kind of achieve all of this.
Exactly, yeah. I think if we can get anything from resistance, it doesn't matter if you're a young child kind of slipping out, bringing back a few potatoes, to a leading member of the Judenrat, it was everyone coming together, that collective community that allowed it to be so effective.
Something I've always found quite interesting is the kind of the life that went on in the ghetto. I believe there were some restaurants. There was almost it was almost like a community. In what regard did that sort of help the kind of spiritual aspects of resistance, the community that was there, the life that went on regardless?
I think if you're struggling, it's even worse if you feel alone, and I think a lot of us experienced that this last year with COVID, the isolation. And so I think you're right, that community spirit coming together, even if it's just having physical bodies near you, or organized efforts like putting on, there was in the Terezin Ghetto, for example, they had an orchestra, so music or plays. That collective effort, I think it's really important as well, and so you're very right in saying that, James.
That's really interesting that we're coming back to music again, because obviously in the first podcast we talked about the importance of the banjo in keeping the spirit of the explorers alive, and that music comes again to sort of save the day in some sense. That's really interesting parallel.
It's almost refusing to be dehumanised, isn't it? When all the force is to dehumanise people is that community, small pleasures, art, culture, civilization seems to shine the bright of how dark things were. That you latch onto those things because they're almost a protest and you're refusing to be what people are saying that you are, which is something less than human.
Exactly. It's allowing them to hold on to their own identity, which is at kind of the root of what anti-Semitism was. It was trying to remove that Jewish identity. So that's, I think, really well said.
I've got a question for everybody on the panel then. It seems the right time for us to have this podcast, be doing this podcast. Over the last couple of years, we've started to hear the phrase anti-Semitism much more in politics. There's almost a sense that over the last 10 years, there are more people are falling into anti-Semitic tropes and attitudes in politics. The comedian and writer David Baddiel recently released a book called Jews Don't Count, where he says for all of the very admirable kind of anti-racist, anti-prejudice focus there is now, that often Jewish people are left out of that, and anti-Jewish racism is left out of that. Is this topic particularly pertinent at the moment? Because there might be a sense in which people are forgetting some of the things that the Holocaust should have taught them.
Well, just today I was having a look at Twitter. I think it's part of The Guardian, Jim Waterston, who posted a tweet of some of the complaints that the BBC had got over different programming. One of David Baddiel's programs, it was kind of a targeted complaint about David Baddiel kind of presenting this program, and you kind of think how often are these tropes kind of present in society? It is really kind of damning when we look around us.
Yeah, I mean, the last few days, the violence in East Jerusalem. I mean, I've in the last week had to block, I think, for 2 or 3 people on Instagram. People have been posting anti-Semitic memes. I don't know whether it's unconsciously or whether they are that's their genuine beliefs. But the prevalence of anti-Semitism in our society is growing a lot, and you don't want to bring this into too much of a political standpoint, but it's not just on the right, and that's something that annoys me a lot. Is a lot of these sort of anti-racist, some might call it woke. I don't tend to use that phrase. Left almost feel they're immune from it. A lot of the British left have a blind spot when it comes to anti-Semitism. The fact that, I can't remember the exact figure, I think it was about 30% of the British electorate voted for a party. I'm not saying that they're all anti-Semitic, but they were willing to at least not prioritise that as a cause in terms of when they decided how they're going to vote for, who they're going to vote for. I think also stuff like anti-capitalism. There's a fine line between the rhetoric when it comes to stuff like greedy bankers, a world conspiracy against the poor. They're against us. Sometimes you have to look at the stuff like the George Soros memes and the on the right, and sort of the right wing conspiracy about the media, or there's a lot of the propaganda from the left, and compare it to the propaganda in Nazi Germany, the hook-nosed bankers with the puppet strings, and the similarities are very, very scary. And what I would encourage anyone listening to this podcast would be to almost try and rationalise your arguments when you debate, because it's not rational for the puppeteer argument, a lot of these arguments, and never assume you're immune from it just because you might think you're anti-racist. And anti-racism has to extend to all groups, all minorities, everyone. So just be cognizant of that.
Yeah, I very much agree with what Mr. Hoggett just said. And I think it goes back to the lessons from Auschwitz sessions that we did, focusing on the relevance, the contemporary relevance in today's world, and how, while we do need to recognise that this is what's happened in the past, we need to ensure that we are learning about this on a personal level and understand the impact it had on human beings in order to ensure that this doesn't happen again. And I think going back to the topic we're talking about today, part of that was, creating projects and presentations and going out into our communities. I've done my project on resistance in the camps, very relevant to the subject today. So I think, going back on what the other two have said, making sure that we are focusing on, teaching people the facts and Well, yes, using emotion, making sure that we are double checking our facts, and fake news is obviously coming into a part of it on all sides of the spectrum. People trying to manipulate the truth and things like that. So yeah, very important to make sure we actually know what we're talking about.
Absolutely.
I have another question for Mum. As an expert on this subject, what do you think are some of the most common misunderstandings about this period and about ghettos, the Holocaust more generally? What do you think, as someone who has studied the subject very closely, what misunderstandings do people tend to have, and what would you like people to understand a little more?
Definitely, and I think actually, and we came out with that fascist rhetoric, that right-wing rhetoric. Well, it was just average people. It could have been you and I who actually helped the Holocaust happen. So it wasn't just Germans. They had occupied local territories in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, the Soviet Union, and all these local communities, their police forces, farmers, they helped to enact the Holocaust. And so I think a generalization that is often made is that Germans, the Nazis, that is where the Holocaust came from, when actually it was a wider movement throughout Europe. And it wasn't really that unexpected, because anti-Semitism was rampant in that interwar period. And so therefore, when we say, well, how could it have happened? I think it could have happened quite easily. And for many people, it didn't take much convincing for them to take part.
So something, if I may just add to that, is that many people prior to the First World War, Germany was seen as a very safe place for Jews compared to places like France, Russia, where there have been pogroms and really embedded anti-Semitism, and it proves that in what many see as one of the most civilised democracies in the world, culturally, democratically, it can happen. I don't think anyone's suggesting that we're currently in 1930s Germany and Britain, but the seeds can't be planted ever, because quite a nasty tree can grow out of it.
I think we've really quite thoroughly explored this topic in a really interesting and enlightening way, and I've been fascinated both by you, Mom, and the depth of what you've been discussing. I'm sure we'll be discussing this for a long time afterwards, but also gentlemen adding some brilliant ideas today. So not so many puns today, but I hope really you've taken away. I think it's been quite a profound discussion. I can feel actually genuinely the goosebumps going at the moment. So I hope you two guys have taken a lot away from it. A slightly more light-hearted note. We haven't had your clue yet, sir, and I feel like this might be the opportunity to bring it in.
This is true, and because this is the fourth podcast we've done. This is right. We might be recording them in a slightly different order, which is why we might be, not to give the game away, but why we might be speaking cryptically. With that in mind, the fourth clue for those of you who are putting these clues, and there is a magnificent prize. I feel like I have to pitch the prize. I want you to imagine a spectacular, magnificent prize, but also imagine a teacher's salary, and put those two things together and slightly manage your expectations. But today's clue is Ishiguro.
One of my favourites. Don't look like that,
So
James.
some of you will be noticing a theme in the clues, but today's is Ishiguro.
I highly recommend reading some. I'm sorry, I'm going to start giving away some of the clues now. I'm going to be quiet on this subject before I get myself in trouble. Yeah, so I have to say, thank you to my fantastic panellists. Thank you to Mom for enlightening us on such an incredibly important subject. As we've said, something that is particularly becoming very relevant today, something to think about, the way we act and the way we speak and the way we share things in society and the way we evaluate news and so on. So I have to do thank yous to our lovely production team. I mustn't forget them, otherwise I'm going to be in a great deal of trouble. So thank you to Tom and his wonderful team and Aman and so on. Thank you very much, you guys. Please do make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is under my name, Jenny Summers. Join up to our Spotify, our Twitter at JHGS English, and also at JHGS History. Don't forget them, very important, otherwise they'll be upset with me. So they're the most important things I need to say. And if you've got a place that you can leave a review, that would be fantastic too. We're trying to spread the word and get this out to the many so they can attain some secret knowledge. See what I did there? Very clever, I'm sure you'll agree. Brilliant. I think, as far as I know, that is all that we have for today, unless you want to add anything else, sir, to round us off. I think
No, just tell your friends, tell your family, ask them if they've listened. If they haven't, look grumpy at them, and we'll see you next time.
Brilliant. Thank you and goodbye.
Thanks all.